Welcome back. It's time to get out of all of the beginner stuff and all the introductory kind of stuff and get into some actual workflows here and work on some production scenes. So the first thing that we're going to work on is a scene where we're going to practice some direct lighting techniques. We're not going to use any type of indirect illumination. And what better indirect lighting example than a scene in outer space? So let's go ahead and hit Control O to open up a scene here. And the scene you're looking for is called Space Start. So we'll open that one up and see what we have. Let's go ahead and hit preview render. Just do a quick little test render here and see what we have. Okay. So not very exciting at first glance. Just seems to be this sort of made up planet over here just kind of sitting in space, and there's some lighting coming in from the top left and not much else going on here. We can also see that the size of the preview render is 720 by 486 pixels. That's too large for a preview render. When we want to preview render, we want to preview render fast, really, really fast. We don't want to get slowed down with preview renders because we're going to be doing preview renders all the time. So the first thing I'm going to do is come over here to the render menu, open up the render manager. There it is. And over here I'm going to make some changes. First thing I'm going to do is down here under the pass output resolution, I'm going to switch from the default and turn on the override scene render options. Then over here in the drop down box, I'm going to switch my preset from NTSC 720 by 486 to a custom format. This will allow me to change the width and height parameters over here. So long as I have the lock aspect ratio turned on, I can just change the width, say to 400 pixels to make it smaller, and the height's going to change accordingly because I have the lock aspect ratio button turned on. Okay, then over here I have my anti-aliasing settings, which by default are set to max level of 1 and a minimum level of -1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to knock the minimum level to -2 and the max level to 0. Now I'll close that. Now if I hit a preview render again, you notice the render is much, much faster. Quality isn't the best, but it's not too bad either. I can see what's going on. And that's the whole point of a preview render, to be able to see what's going on, but see it quickly. Okay, so now let's have a look at this scene here. We have this planet sitting here in our scene, and if we zoom out, we can see that there are some what appears to be stars in the background. There's also these sort of galaxies or these strange shapes out here, and these are just, if I come in here and I select them, all they are alpha cards, and they're sitting there in the background, and they have alpha map textures. If I go ahead and open up the render tree on one of these, I can see that, for example, this one is Starfield 1, has here an image, what appears to be just a background image of some stars and maybe a little bit of nebula or some stardust, things like that, some gases and whatnot. Same thing with this one over here. This one, if I open up the render tree, same thing. Has some kind of a nebula effect over here, created by our art team. Okay, and if we turn over here to the right, we're going to see we have a lot of stars, a lot of alpha cards over here, creating some pretty neat effects out here. We have this more interesting, very large nebula, as the name over here in MCP suggests. It's a very large nebula that encompasses a large portion of our scene, as we can see. And if I zoom out a lot, I can see what I have here is a giant sphere around my scene. Now this sphere doesn't actually render. I used the sphere to create a sort of star field using ice. So let me show you how that works. Let me go over here and see if I can select my point cloud over here. And that's not it. Okay, there it goes. I selected it. Easier way of selecting is by coming over here to the Explorer and just picking it right here, Starfield Point Cloud. Okay, and if I hit Alt and 9 to open up the ice tree view here, I can see what I have. It's a very simple ice tree setup. Of course, this isn't an ice tutorial, so I'm not going to go into this too much or deviate from our main topic. But I did feel it was necessary to come and show you how I set this up. So basically, I switched the emit from surface compound to an emit from volume compound so I can create these stars. And I'm also using a null controller force to repel the stars. So let me show you how that works. This green null that I have here in my scene is basically repelling these so-called little stars here from my point cloud from ice and pushing them away from my planet. just so I don't have any strange stars right here, right next to my planet, which obviously wouldn't make much sense and will look really weird in the render. Okay, so that's how that works. Now if I do a test render here, save this area, we check this out, we will be able to see the nebula because they're alpha cards, as well as some stars there that I created more alpha cards. But if you look over here on the left, all we get is pitch black darkness. We can't see our star field that's being created with ice. So, what's going on there? Well, it's the lighting in the scene. We have to set up our lighting correctly in order to be able to, to render this correctly. So we're going to do that in this video. I'm going to start to set up some lights. Okay, so now that I showed you the scene, let's go ahead and just get started with this. I'll go over here to the primitive menu, go to light, and grab myself a point light. This point light's going to act almost as a star in the distance here, and I'll show you how I'm going to use that. Right now the point light's actually inside the planet because the planet's located at point 0 on the grid. So if I move this over, you'll see it, there's my point light. I'm going to close the PPG. First thing I'm going to do is rename this point light, of course. So let's open up the PPG and let's rename it from the default point light name to Starlight, and we'll make this Starlight 1. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do is move it into position. So I want to place it so it's right in front of this this star or this little bright spot on my alpha card. So that's not going to be too hard to do, mainly because the alpha card's there, so I can just go ahead and use it sort of as a guide to go ahead and place this over here. So it's something like that, about -21 in the X, and the Y maybe I'll move it to about -9 point something, and in the Z maybe I'll move it a little bit closer to it, about -117 right there, so it's right in front of it. That'll work out pretty good. Problem now is if I do a preview render, that point light is affecting my planet, which obviously doesn't look too good. And if I look at this side of the planet where the point light's facing, I can see that the planet looks pretty bad right now. That doesn't look too great. So let's go to the actual starlight here and let's make some changes to it. Let's open up its PPG. Let's first of all, let's turn on shadows for the light and take the umbra all the way down. Next thing we're going to do is maybe increase this intensity, but maybe not at the moment. Let's change the color. I'm going to take the blue channel here and knock it down to close to about 0.5, and I'll take the green channel, knock that to about 0.7, and that's pretty good. I want kind of this peach type of color. But you can see that even though making those changes, if I do render region on the planet, we're still going to see the lighting on the planet. The purpose of this light, this starlight that I created, is actually to light up my star field created with ice, not to light up the planet. I just want the planet to be lit up by one sunlight that's in the distance. And this starlight here is not that sunlight. So what can I do to make that light not affect my planet? Well, we can use light association XSI to control what our lights affect in our scene and what they can't affect. In this case, I want it to affect everything in my scene except for the planet. So let's open up the lights PPG. If I go over here to the selective light property, I can see I have two options, inclusive and exclusive. Inclusive is the default. What I want to do is switch to exclusive. Basically what this means is that I can use light association to choose the light's behavior, choose what it can actually affect and what it can't affect using these two parameters, inclusive and exclusive. So I'll switch to exclusive and you'll get a better idea of how this works as you see me do this. I'm going to open up the Explorer and I'm just going to dig in here into this Starlight 1, and you'll see that there's this group called Associated Models, and this is created by default with all the lights that you create in XSI. Let me just hit the back button here on my PPG. I'm going to pin it down so it doesn't go anywhere. What I want to do is I want to take the planet and I want to add it to the associated models group that pertains to that starlight. So if the planet's selected, I'll right click on the associated models group in the Explorer and I'll go ahead and click on add to group. and that'll go ahead and add the planet to that group. With the option set to exclusive, what this means is that anything outside of the associated models group will be affected by the light. Anything inside will not be affected by the light. So the way you can think of this is exclusive mode means everything that's excluded from the group, everything outside of the group right here will be affected by the light or lit up by the light. If you switch to inclusive, what that means is that only objects inside the group will be affected by the light. In this case, my planet would still be affected. If I come in here and I do a render preview there, you can see my planet is still being affected by the light. So let me close that. And that's because it's set to inclusive. If I switch to exclusive and I do another render preview, you notice now the planet is no longer affected by that light. So these associated models and this selective light property or light association, as it's known in XSI, is extremely important if you work lighting up scenes in CG. You pretty much have to know how that works in order to work with lighting to the best of your abilities. So now that that's done, I'm going to go ahead and close that PPG right there. Okay, now the next thing I want to do is I want to be able to light up my star field with that light, because you're going to notice something. If I come over here and do a render region of this area out here, let me increase my anti-aliasing a bit. You can see that I still can't see my stars that are being created with ice, and that's a problem. So let's fix that problem. I'm going to open up the Explorer and I'm going to select the star field point cloud, which are the ice particles representing the star field. And I'm going to hit 7 on the keyboard to open up its render tree. And you can see it has a pretty simple render tree. One of the newest shaders in XSI 7 is the Loom beam shader. And you can find that pretty easily. If I come over here and open up the preset manager and I go down here to volume, you won't actually find it here. Okay, edit that out of the video, edit that out of the video. Starting again in 3, 2, 1. One of the newest shaders in XSI 7 is the Loom beam shader. Let me show you how this shader works, and first I'll show you where to get it. If I come over here to the nodes menu and I go down to volume, you won't actually find it right here per se, so you have to click on more. And that'll open up a browser here. Now you can look for it. If you go over here to the mental images folder, you'll find this Loom beam shader. So I'll just cancel because I already have it in my render tree. And if we open it up, here's the Loom beam shader. It's PPG. In the way that I'm using it, I'm going to use it to light up my stars in a pretty ingenious way. It's a custom little setup that I came up with here. I'm going to use this Loom beam shader to create a volumetric effect, so to speak, that's going to allow me to light up my stars using these starlights in a pretty neat way. But the Loom beam shader is not going to work right now because there's no lights associated. The way this shader works, you have to bring in some lights and get them onto this list over here for it to work. Since the Loom beam shader is attached to the volume port of the material that's in turn attached to the ice star field, the Loom beam shader is going to affect my ice stars, but the Loom beam shader needs some lights associated with it in this list in order for it to be affected so that it can affect our stars, if that makes any sense. So basically, our lights are going to work with this shader, and our shader is going to work with this stars material, and this stars material is going to work on our ice star field. So it all works together. Okay, so to get it to work is pretty simple. All I have to do is go to pick item, and I get a list of all the lights in my scene. Good thing that I renamed my point light to Starlight 1 because it makes it easier to find. So I'll select Starlight 1, then I'll just right click outside that menu and you'll see Starlight 1 is added to that list. So let's go ahead and let's close that PPG since we don't need it for the moment. You'll also notice that I have a gradient texture shader connected to the color input of my Loom beam shader over here. And if I open that up, you'll see that I have this gradient that I created. It goes from pink to green to this soft blue color. What this will do, it'll randomize the look of my stars by creating this gradient across my star field, which will make my stars go from warm colors to cool colors. Warm colors being the pink and cool colors being the green and the blue. And that'll create a more randomized and natural effect and look to the lighting of my ice stars in the background. just to make things look more convincing. So another little production trick that you can use when working on CG scenes like this. Okay, so let me close the render tree there. And now what I'll do is I'll render out here somewhere. And you notice that I still can't see my stars too well. The only stars I can see are the ones from the alpha card in the background over there. Okay. What I'm going to do for the moment is I'm going to take the alpha card there, which is called Nebula 5, as you can see in the PPG, or in the MCP, I'm sorry. And I'm going to hide it. And I'm going to render around that light, and you can see that we still can't see any stars, even though our anti-aliasing, I've increased it in the render region. So what in the world is going on? How come we can't see them? Well, let's take the light and make some changes to it. The first thing that I'm going to do is change my light intensity. The reason I really can't see anything is because my light intensity is so low. So let's increase it to something like, say, 50 and see what we get. Now I can start to see some stars coming out, and this is good. It means that everything's working like the way that it's supposed to. I'm going to increase my anti-aliasing more so I can see more of the stars in the background. Let's increase the intensity more, because what happens is, if I close that, let me close the render region there and go back to my PPG. Select my light there, frame in on it, and then let's zoom out a little bit and do a render region from here, let's say. You can see it's a little bit difficult. Actually, I really can't see the stars in the background. Let me go ahead and do a render region with high anti-aliasing. I can see some stars. The more intense my light is, the more stars I'll be able to see, because the more light there'll be to light up these stars. So what I want to do is increase it to a pretty high number, something like 200. And now I can see a lot more stars. See that? So now I'm lighting my ice stars more appropriately and more correctly than I was before. I'm going to go ahead and leave it on an intensity of 200, which looks pretty good. Okay, so now that I'm not really going to make any changes for the moment to this PPG, I'm just going to go ahead and close it. So I've created my my first Starlight. The last thing I'm going to do to this Starlight is I'm going to increase its scale, because right now it's very tiny, makes it hard to select it. So I'll come over here to the transform menu, and I'll hold down shift and right click on the X, Y, and Z channels there. And then I'm just going to hit 2 and hit enter, and that'll switch all of my channels here, all my parameters to 2, just so it's a little bit easier to see and to select. So now let me go over here and let's create another Starlight for this nebula over here. And what I'll do is I'll go in the Explorer, and I'm going to take Nebula 5, which I went ahead and I hit it earlier. I'm going to unhide it simply by hitting H on the keyboard again. There we go. So I'm going to select my light that I created here, my Starlight 1, and I'm going to hit Control, Alt, and D on the keyboard, D for dog, to duplicate it. And I'm going to go ahead and place it somewhere over here in front of this fake nebula that we have over here. And I'm also going to scale this up. So let me go in here and let me hold down shift and right click on X, Y, and Z. And I'm going to type in, say, 9, and that'll make a pretty nice big light there. Makes more sense. And in terms of the placement, let me go ahead and place it at, let me see, let's place it at about negative 77 and change. And for the Y, let me see, let me just put it right about here. And for the Z, let me push this back closer to the nebula, about right there. That's pretty good. So it's in that nice bright spot of the nebula. Because I duplicated the light that I had already created earlier, the Starlight 1, if I come over here to the not to the render tree, but if I open up its PPG, it has the same light association properties and whatnot, so I don't have to come in here and do any of the light association again. It's already pretty much done for me. So now it's pretty easy. All I have to do is come into PPG and make some changes. I'm going to take the color and I'm going to change the color. So I'm going to increase the blue channel here to 1, take the green channel, increase that to about, or decrease it to about 0.6, 0.7, something like that, close to 0.7. And then I'm going to take the red channel and knock it down to about 0.6 and a half. Somewhere between 0.6 and 0.7 is going to work out pretty good. So I have this nice bluish color. And that's going to give some of the stars in this area over here more of a bluish color, as well as some stars over here, because the lights are actually pretty close to each other, so they'll be able to affect each other's stars. And the intensity, since this is a much larger light and we have this bright blue nebula over here, let's more than double the intensity to about the setting of 500, and everything else looks pretty good. So now let's come over here and let's do a big render region here of the screen. Now we can see that we see lots of stars in the background. And if you look carefully, the colors are different. Some stars are brighter than others, and some stars are certain different hues of blue all the way to a soft red pink color, okay, which looks fantastic. And that helps to sell the effect of the scene more. Because if we didn't do that, if we didn't use the Loom beam shader to use the gradient to add that variation of color to the stars, every star here in ice would have the same exact light intensity. They would all look just like white dots. And that wouldn't look very convincing or realistic. So it's a detail to take into effect in order to sell the effect better. Okay, just to wrap up this video, let's create one more light. Now we're going to create the actual light that's going to represent a star or a sun that's pretty close by in this planet's solar system, so to speak. So let's go ahead and do that. If I hit 8 to open up the Explorer, you'll notice that I have a default light that was created for me automatically by XSI. Well, you'll also notice that if I go to Ambience, I do have Scene Ambience on. That's a default behavior of XSI. And if I come over here and render out this planet, let me see if I got it from the dark side. There we go. There's the dark side of the planet. It doesn't look very dark, does it? It's actually a little bit bright. And the reason this is happening behind the planet is because of that ambient lighting. I don't like that ambient lighting because it's very fake, and it hurts my lighting when I'm creating a scene for production. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take the ambience, hold down control, and knock it all the way down to pure 0. That way it's pure black. And if I render again, you notice now it's totally black. This is more realistic in terms of the behavior in outer space, the way that light works. Unless there's a light source behind the planet and it's pretty close, you're not going to see anything behind the planet. It's just going to look pitch black. So what we're going to do is create ourselves a sunlight, and it's going to be an infinite light. If I open up the PPG for the default light, you notice that it is set up as an infinite light by default. So instead of deleting it and creating a brand new infinite light, why not just use this one, right? So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to open up its PPG, and I'm going to rename the light to, say, sunlight. Got to check my spelling there. And I'm going to make some changes to the light settings here, but not right now. You notice that the light has this H next to it, this gray H. This means that the visibility in the viewport has been turned off for the light. However, its renderability is still on, which is why we can see it render when we go ahead and do our preview renders. So I'm going to hit H on the keyboard to unhide it completely. If I close the Explorer, you can see that our light is right there. And if I switch to wireframe view, there's our sunlight, or our infinite light, inside of our planet there, which is obviously no good. So what we need to do is move this light out of the way. Okay, so let's place this light where it basically belongs. So what I'm going to do here, let me hit undo a couple of times to get it back to the center of the grid there. And what I'm going to do is move it in its local z-axis. You'll notice that I'm in local mode over here in the MCP. And what I'm doing here is just moving it in the z-axis, and I'm going to get it to about 49, 50 units up, something like that. It's pretty good. So if we kind of rotate over here, this is where it is. It's going to be located right above that planet, aiming sort of from that nebula somewhere. So there's this sort of star that's somewhere in that nebula. Okay. All right. So we have the sun positioned where we want it, more or less. So let's open a PPG and see what changes there are to make. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this light and I'm going to increase the intensity to a value of 1. I'm also going to turn on shadows and knock the umbra all the way down. And that's about all that I'm going to do to this light. I'm not going to change the color or anything like that. It's just a basic sunlight. And I'll just close that out. And it's going to look pretty much the same as before, as when we had just the default light, as you can see. And if we look up at the sunlight, we really can't see a sun or anything like that. We can't see the actual sun itself. But we can change that. And that's what we're going to do. But this video has been running long enough, so I'm going to end it now. And in the next video, we're going to set up some flare lighting effects and get this looking really good.